But what sort of length are we talking about, the whole thing?
About 10 to 15 pages, I think.
Are we talking about manuscript pages or published pages? Sorry.
Published pages.
No.
So in terms of
Journal
words,
pages.
what's that? So is that
Well,
like,
actually, I mean, if you look at the format of the Epidemics Volume 2015, that was one of these journals that gets a lot on a page. So the papers were only actually 4 or 5 pages, weren't
Oh,
they?
okay.
But so,
Well,
so
maybe they can be 8 or 10 epidemics pages.
Is there an example? I don't write like this. There's a particular style, presumably. But do you have an example in mind, like with this kind of challenges? Something you've done before, perhaps?
yeah, have you not seen? There's the whole 2015 volume, and if you do you have access to the Dropbox?
Yeah, I'm there.
In the main directory of the main IDP folder, the very first entry says 2015 something or other.
I haven't dared touching anything except for economics. Okay, so I look there. Thanks very much.
Just look at that. So yeah, but I mean that was firstly, that was a journal that had rather a compressed style, got a lot of words on a page, and also there were 22 papers then, and this time we're having a mainstream of 10 pages with possibly some extra. So I guess we might read into that they, yeah. So I think this time round, if you look at how many words there were in the 2015 volume, up to about twice as long, I think we'd be quite comfortable with. It goes beyond that, I think we'd be wanting to look at whether you were standing out like a sore thumb or whether there were ways of shortening it.
This looks like 2,000 words. These look like 2,000 words.
I think they were 2.5,
Yeah.
maybe even 3,000, but that was including references.
Yeah.
So if we said so I suppose we said 5,000 words would be just fine. If it's going a lot over 5,000 words, as I say, maybe we'd begin to ask if you couldn't be more concise and maybe summarize some things and give more references to things that appear elsewhere. But of course, I suppose that's with any paper, it's going to get some refereeing. If you can, if you can justify the length that you're saying original things that are not said elsewhere, then that's fairly cast iron defense.
And I guess we should as well say, Dennis, that if some of these, like Eli, you were saying with the behaviour stuff, you think there's just so much to put in, it could be a paper of its own. There could be a spin-off paper specifically on a topic in more detail if you think that would. Some of the challenges papers have got companion papers. Yeah,
well, there are two things there. You could possibly say, well, this is getting a bit long, but really we're trying to cover 2 subjects here. The example I give at the moment is we've got one on interventions, and vaccines are indeed a kind of intervention, but there's actually so much to say about the non-pharmaceutical interventions, which have so much come to the fore in this pandemic, that may well be that vaccines ends up as a separate paper. So in the same way, you could say that some of these things are to do with, let's say, you call behaviour, and have a if it thought it made sense to have a separate. But if you like, you ought to keep. But yeah.
And Eli, on behaviour, actually, I looked at the old challenges papers, and they did have a whole challenge paper on behaviour. I don't know if you've seen it.
I just noticed that, and I just made a note on the document that's in Dropbox. Hopefully I didn't mess it up for anyone. But I did. There's the funk. I didn't realize that was in that. I think I'd seen that before, but.
Yeah, and there is a paragraph in it, actually. I forgot to add that to the Dropbox, but there is a paragraph in it where they specifically say there needs to be better interdisciplinary links, particularly with economists, and they reference that book that you wrote a chapter in as well.
Yeah.
But I think but the bottom line.
I actually think that the time for thinking about this, listening to, I think it was Dennis who was just saying this. I think that we should probably focus the behavior bit on this is sort of like understanding non-pharmaceutical intervention, because I actually think this is the bit that in understanding non-pharmaceutical interventions and understanding the interactions between non-pharmaceutical interventions and traditional interventions like vaccine. I think that's why behaviors. And I don't think that's always kind of been the challenge in my opinion of like, why do you put behavior in these models? It's because there was like no way to actually model non-pharmaceutical interventions in a classic epidemiological model other than tuning parameters in sort of a somewhat arbitrary way.
And can I ask, because I was sort of looking at one of the papers you did with Charles Perrings about how you have the contact, you alter contacts based on like utility. So you have the utility function. And so is that some way that they can, does that link into that, the compliance part of cost benefit analysis? So it's that idea that if you think if you agree with the policy or if you think it is important, then you are more likely to comply. So it's kind of a way of explicitly bringing in compliance rather than just a parameter of we assume 60% of people comply. You're kind of explicitly modeling whether or not they comply based on how much value they place.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think there's I think there's two things going on, right? And I think they're very confusing. So what those agents are doing is they're maximizing their expected utility. And so there's some people for which the trade-offs are such that maybe not complying, like they understand the system, but the trade-offs are like not complying is sort of optimal, like they need to feed their families. On the other hand, there's this expectations part. And if you're in certain places and you're in a media bubble, it might actually be that if you think the whole thing is a hoax, so your subjective probability of getting infected is 0. That like, and the problem with a lot of this is it enters multiplicatively. A lot of these things like wind up like from a mathematical standpoint is they wind up entering multiplicatively, which means that you can't really, it's really hard to separate them. Right, and you get a lot of observationally equivalent sort of theorems. Is that?
Yeah.
Is that the way this is? So this is going to epidemics. So who is the target audience, right? Because like when we first started, this is through sort of a mathematics, like, is it? But I think of epidemics as being more sort of the place between like math epi and public health, and not like a proof theorem type journal typically. Is that like, maybe I'm wrong?
No, I think that's true, but I think there's no reason to put that you can't put down mathematical challenges, if that makes sense. Like,
okay.
So for example, in the data paper, they were talking about how like linking data sets is a very big mathematical and statistical challenge. So you can put down a challenge that needs to be solved mathematically, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think last time there were a lot of things which involved really quite difficult stochastic process type things, but they weren't they weren't the details of the models, and it was just what the challenge was to include some particular feature or whatever in these models rather than
yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I'm sure you'll find challenges in some of particularly the papers referring to the 2015 ones referring to modeling, where implicitly behind it, what they're talking about is models involving difficult mathematics, and the challenge is to produce more difficult mathematics to solve these challenges. I mean, not many, but there'll certainly be some like that. Mm-hmm. But in the but when you're setting but the task is to describe in a maximum of about a page, what that challenge is. But it doesn't you'll find very few of the actual mathematical formulae in the 2015 volume, because it'll be referring to papers where you'll be able to find the existing mathematical stuff, and you'll be trying to say in words what the challenge is, which is usually something you can say in words rather than trying to write down a formula.
Yeah, I guess I was more thinking about kind of what I just said, is that a lot of these things are written down as like strings of multiplicative processes. So you might as well, if you're going to parameterize it all anyway, you want like, and like getting past that, I have found to be like a big challenge, right? It's like when I work with mathematicians, it's like, well, here's this, and they're like, well, can't you just put a parameter in there? And it's like, well, yes, you can make things observationally equivalent and you can fit models, but are you getting at mechanism? So there's like this issue of like, why are you doing the math in the first place? And that's why I'm trying to understand like how to nuance those, thinking about that.
Well, I think you assume that you're writing for other people who will be able to appreciate that argument. I mean, not everybody will, but and different papers will appeal more to different audiences. But basically, we're writing for people broadly like us who will have greater or lesser knowledge of different areas, but you know, will appreciate arguments about identifiability of parameters and so on.
I mean, I think the audience in 2015 was perhaps slightly more for a known community, or well, network of communities of scientists across quite a range of things, from some pretty mathematical people to some pretty hands-on biological scientists, let's say. And I think this time round it's the same audience, except that because of the huge amount of additional interest we've had this year with the pandemic, there are a whole lot of people coming from rather different backgrounds, but typically, let's say, mathematicians who don't know much about epidemics, or economists who don't know much about epidemics, or whatever, who want to understand and get involved in this. So I suppose that's hopefully what a good introduction to each of these papers will do, is to try and suck in people who have suddenly decided that epidemiology and pandemics are really interesting and they'd like to understand and, if possible, contribute. Second, but the second thought is that it's one reason, I think, for having this kind of structure of separate challenges, that I think it hopefully makes easier for a really wide range of people to get something out of the volume. That, you know, some readers will just be interested in one or two of these papers, may only interest in part of them, and the format is supposed to make it possible for people like that to check with the introductory part of a paper as to what the background is and whether they think they're going to get anything out of it. And then they may be, if there are 8 challenges in the paper, they may be just really, if they're really interested in just one or two of those, and they can go and read that section without having to read everything else. Now, of course, some of the papers will actually be like that, and others will perhaps have more of a thread running through, and it's difficult to read challenge number 5 without having looked at challenges 1, 2, 3, and 4. But I think that the sort of modular structure hopefully enables us to do a sort of proselytizing job of trying to look across the whole field of science as related to pandemics and make it accessible to more people.
I would just add that the previous volume seems to have been pretty well received and widely cited. So, you know, hopefully people are seeing it and finding that sort of thing useful.
So I'm conscious of time. So I think Nick and Sean, are you guys happy with, you know, 3 pages and happy to just continue on?
And I assume that what we'll do is we'll all read each other's and make suggestions and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah,
blah.
and we'll need to pull together an intro and stuff.
And what's the time frame for this? So when are we expecting a completed and first drafts and things like that?
Well, Boxing Day, I think. Go on, Kira.
I mean, I think if we can start having I think if by the beginning of the new year, each section has got paragraphs and it's starting to begin to look like a paper that could be read through, that would be good. And I would hope that by February there'd be a draft. I don't know what.
Okay, so it's sort of like first drafts of our bits by the beginning of January.
Yeah, that would be. I think
Okay.
good.
Exactly.
Just you need to know these things.
Does that seem a reasonable sort of timescale for you people?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if this is like first drafts and there hasn't been any iteration across the various sections or anything like that, I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
Nick, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, I could write something, write my bits the first week you come back.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. Camille, am I saying your name right, Camille? Is that how you say your name? Am I saying it? Yeah. Is it? No.
You know, people call me Cam.
Cam. Okay.
Give up on the rest.
Let's go with
Okay, Cam. Thanks.
This is my city. Yeah, so I'm sorry I missed the last meeting. It was not somehow anyway, and I have to go in 3 minutes because I'm teaching.
No, that's fine.
But yeah, I haven't really added to the. I haven't added. I suppose mine, as we discussed before, is a little bit different than yours. Is that it will be much more aggregate, and I can write about challenges of understanding the shock, trying to understand the size of the shock, how it goes, the spillover of the shock. It's I think much less about cooperation in terms of vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
I know it was a note there about how do we cooperate internationally, but much more perhaps about the economic effects, how they translate, and maybe potentially how they're different from other major shocks we've seen. So the network effects, the spillover effects. I can attempt to write a couple of paragraphs for the beginning of the year. Yeah, if that's okay.
That sounds great.
You might think it's odd because the rest of you are actually working in quite really specific and.
Well, no, I think, well, Dennis, you were saying you wanted this to be quite broad, right? You want to kind of hopefully encompass different elements of economics in this paper.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
it sounds good.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Cam. Does anyone have any other bits? Eli and Jay, are you guys happy with plans?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, I could write up, a couple paragraphs on the behavioral side, which is, how do we structure preferences and beliefs, and and then the next step, given we understand the observations on preferences and beliefs, how are they incorporated into the mathematical models? A lot of times they're not. They still make presumptions of rational choice or complete information just because the dynamics become way too much once you start adding in the uncertainty and the asymmetric information. So there is that leap that has to be made in terms of incorporating more realistic preference and belief functions into this type of problem.
Cool. That sounds good.
I think that'll line up well, Jay. I think what you're talking about will work with kind of where I'm thinking as well. And so let's write and then touch base.
Okay. Yeah,
Cool.
Finoff was stuck between Cheyenne and Laramie, so I'll update him when.
That's fine. I was going to send an email around to everyone, and I've recorded this, so he can always just catch up on it if he has some time. Yeah. Thanks, Cam. And I guess maybe then it might make sense not to meet the week beginning the 4th, but to give people a chance to get back in and maybe meet again on the Thursday, the week beginning the 11th. What's that? The 14th, maybe? Thursday the 14th at 3.
Okay.
On the 14th, yes.
Yeah. And was the Outlook invite the best way? Do you want me to get them to do Outlook invites again? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I have to say, when I clicked on that, that's where I got into trouble with this password.
Oh, okay. I will see whether we can get that.
I have a separate question, just whilst anybody who knows anything about the epidemiology is here, nothing to do with this, but I'm idly curious to know, I mean, when all this started, do you think the epidemiologists sort of told governments that you've got kind of two choices here? Either you have, you know, as far as non-behavioral interventions are concerned, you've either got ones where you sort of put it in and then you relax and then you have some second wave that will naturally come and then you can do it again and then there'll be a third wave and so on and so forth. Or you can have a, you know, absolutely watertight lockdown and then you don't relax anything until there's zero infection and you have track and trace to deal with local outbreaks. So is it like,
John, I think that different countries had different ideas.
well, no, but what I want to know is whether the epidemiologists would have said, look, to government, look, there are these two basic ways you can go. You either go, you know, have your lockdown and relax it, and then there'll be another second wave, have a lockdown, relax it, there'll be a third wave, until a vaccine comes along. Or you have a real major lockdown and you don't relax until there's zero infection, and then you have obvious local outbreaks, but you have track and trace. So you have, you know, localized interventions. Or do you go the route where you just have these sequence of aggregate waves?
I think both were on the table, and they oscillate.
Well, that's what
but I may be wrong. I haven't been in the discussions to have any first-hand knowledge.
I think the modelling groups were. I think the modelling groups in Europe and certainly the UK, because they were expecting flu and because no one's ever dealt with flu by the sort of really trying to stamp it out, they sort of rather assumed that wasn't going to be an option, whereas maybe both the modelers and the governments were more in the Far East, were, because they had the experience of SARS, were more of the mindset that if they could stamp it out, that would be worth doing. So
I think there was also the view that in the UK at least, you know, being that dictatorial or authoritarian, whatever, about trying to really stamp it out was something that wouldn't be an option here for a while.
No, I quite understand.
The Imperial College model, the early Imperial College model, Sean, did the sort of on, off,
exactly,
thing.
And that's why I wondered whether there was ever any other one that was shown to them.
Other models that were coming out of the modeling groups, so the issue was with all of those is none of them were actually modeling behavior. They were literally turning behavior on and off. They were like changing the transmission coefficients. They were just turning them up and down.
I must say, I thought when I saw the Imperial model about this on off, I thought that is a modeling from a modeler who's doing modeling for modeling's sake and has sort of allowed themselves to get carried away. I just thought that's daft. In the real world, surely if you can do that kind of control, why not go for stamping it out? You know.
So I think
they were imagining some kind of way of dealing with an endemic thing or something that.
The paper I just sent you, Sean, deals with this.
Oh, it does. Okay. Right. Well, no, I'm very interested because ex post it's clear there are two models.
The issue with all of these models is what policy you choose has a lot to do with the arrival rate of therapeutics and vaccines.
I quite understand that. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And so, like, you know, we're saying, you know, one of the things I was saying was I actually early on, I'm not, you know, Sweden's taken a lot of flack, but the idea of protect hospital capacity and try and start building up some immunity if in these groups that weren't infected, if you don't expect vaccines or therapeutics for many years, that would be the rational thing to do.
Well, would it? I'm not so sure, is it? I take the point that it must depend, as it were, when you think effective treatment or vaccinations must come along. But it does look, I suppose the thing that, and I take that point, but whereas what strikes me now is it's quite clear ex post that there are these two models.
So there's
And-
a paper by Scott Barrett and Hoyle on tuberculosis, smallpox, not polio,
Oh, okay.
on polio and polio eradication from like the early 2000s. And basically the conditions for something like I mean, this is using a vaccine to eradicate polio, and it's really, really, basically you get there with smallpox. And I can't remember the results with polio, but it like depended on like parameter. It was within the uncertain parameter space. So the problem with a lockdown is that it's very hard in a model to actually eradicate these pathogens. It's impossible in a continuous time model, right? And so as soon as you relax, they come back. So so the paper I just sent you is on school closures, but you can think of, there's sort of a quasi lockdown in there as well. You can think about lockdowns, right? Is all they do is delay and spread out cases. They have very little effect on the cumulative number of cases if the actual dynamics aren't changed through the introduction of a vaccine or a therapeutic. So what you can do is you can stretch out that peak, and by having fewer cases at any one moment in time, you can do things like preserve hospital capacity. But when you actually integrate under the curve, it changes a little bit, but not meaningfully. Certainly not to a level of measurement precision.
I can understand why the maths might be like that, but then I suppose what I'm trying to grapple with is, now as we look at it, it looks like there were two strategies, and one was just much more effective on both lives and economic costs. At least now, I mean, it's like those who locked down hard, and then whenever there were outbreaks, they were localized, and there was track and trace local lockdowns, whereas those countries, basically most of Europe and North America, that have had these sequence of waves, have just done much worse on both lives and.
I mean, I don't know that things like New Zealand is a good control for North America. I don't know that's a good counterfactual, and I don't know. I think there's a paper that came out a week or two ago about like variations in some of the mutations in the virus, and I mean I didn't read it closely, but like it seems to have gotten more infectious over the epidemic. I don't, who knows, right? Like I think that but I think the issue is that I certainly agree with you. Like today, if you were to ask me what would a government do, like, yeah, having stay-at-home orders makes a lot of sense because there is a vaccine and it's a distribution problem, and you're basically buying an option. But in March, where if you looked at the history of vaccine development, you're looking at 5 or 6 years until you have an effective vaccine, best case. And if you actually looked at the details of this, we never had a vaccine for an RNA virus before.
No, I agree entirely about that. And obviously the timing of when you think a vaccine or a treatment is going to come along is going to be critical in your choice and strategy. But I would just be fascinated to know whether the epidemiologists were, as it were, seriously suggesting you've got these two kinds of lockdown strategies. And I asked the question partly because, of course, I'm familiar with the imperial stuff that came out, and they presented it as indeed we've now experienced it, a series of aggregate waves where you tighten, relax, tighten, relax. And I'm just genuinely curious about whether the epidemiologists were presenting the alternative, as it were, Chinese or New Zealand or Australian even
I think
solution.
Both were considered, but as I said, I think they thought that the sort of Far East New Zealand type or whatever type options wouldn't work here. But also on the other side, I think they weren't expecting, because as Dennis said, they were thinking more of flu type things. They weren't allowing for the vast amount of asymptomatic spread. So I think they were assuming that they could control it by track and trace or whatever, but they would be able to keep a closer lid on it one way or another than they have actually been able to.
There were a whole lot of things. I mean, the following are UK points, but perhaps they refer to other countries to some degree as well. I mean, the UK, I mean, first of all, there was really, well, I was going to say there's no attempt to stop it getting in by travel, but what's not really true, because we had these various quarantine things, but they weren't, there certainly wasn't an early strategy to really try and stop it getting in. And of course, how effective that would have been, I don't know, because in the case of Scotland, at least, the cases have been shown to have come from about 100 separate introductions. And obviously New Zealand is more isolated and certainly both behaved more effectively, but also had an easier task to do. But I think the other thing is that the lockdown on-off thing in the UK, I think that it was to some extent presented as not that we're waiting for a vaccine, as that there's an intermediate strategy, which is where you lock down to a point where the number of cases gets low, and a good track and trace system may then be able to stop it from coming back. You can relax to a certain extent. You try and get people to do a certain amount of distancing, whatever, so as to make the task more manageable, but you have a good track and trace system. And in the UK, for political reasons, so don't ask me to go there, for the basically we have a crap track and trace system. And so that never came through. We came out of lockdown. If we'd had a really good track and trace system at that stage, we'd have kept things better under control.
I asked the question actually genuinely out of idle curiosity, with the benefit of hindsight and so on and so forth. But I also asked the question because of being interested to know how science is going to emerge whenever the various inquiries take place into this.
Well, I mean, I think what's
being said,
and
so will economists be in this? And the question is,
in economic terms, you would have said that it would be worth paying very large sums to get your track and trace system working really well, but instead, really large sums were paid at people who made the track and trace get worse. So. Well, but
this is Dennis, this is the fallacy, though, of like that discussion, which is track and trace and testing programs are substitutes. And what we were saying 6 months ago.
No, they can be part of that. What's
well, yeah, but in some sense they're substitutes, right? And if you have a trace program, all that is it's a degree of targeted testing. And there are other ways to do targeted testing that probably would have been more effective in Western societies than the Chinese approach to track and trace because of cultural reasons, right? And the problem, frankly, is that like testing wasn't very good at the beginning. We were slow getting testing. We couldn't muster track and trace. And then we've continued to have misinformation, right? Like, I think that's actually been the real challenge here. We've got a call, I guess, next week. I just found out with like the governor of Ohio that I've worked with people here that it's basically using a Bayesian updating method to actually stratify your testing and to make testing easier and cheaper, like to actually, move your testing sites around to hunt, which is sort of an intermediate between a track and trace and a just blanket carpet bomb testing. And so I think that there's just a lot of things that people have bought onto. There's one specific way to do this, but at the end of the day, it really comes down to people's expected utility. And if people don't expect this thing to matter at all, it's going to be impossible to do anything. Right, Jay?
Well, that must be true.
If you look at, so if you look at New Zealand, there are several they were much better at getting the public on side. So, getting the ones who perhaps didn't care for themselves. So I suspect there are large proportions of the New Zealand population who will have said, I don't think I'm going to get it. Anyway, I'm young and healthy. Awesome. If I get it, it won't matter. But nevertheless, because the government behaved in a sort of consistent, inclusive sort of way, they were persuaded to stay on side. There's the they had a test track and trace to stamp out the reintroductions they got, as indeed they did in Australia. But of course, the third thing on their side is that New Zealand is much less connected to the rest of the world. So the borders problem was so much easier for them. So I'm not saying that, it's hard to see that working in the USA. I mean, there are just so many routes into the USA that as long as it's rampant in other parts of the world, we'd have problems. Sorry, we lost you.
But I guess we should probably wrap up because I don't want to take too much of people's time. But thank you very much.
Well, no, thank you. I'm interested to hear about it. Yeah.
I mean, I think on your point, Sean, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's nothing to